My parents drained my bank accounts for years to fund my sister's perfect life. Then, at a massive Thanksgiving dinner with 21 relatives, they announced they would be retiring into my future house and leaving their estate to her. My father laughed and told everyone I was just a walking paycheck, claiming I would never own anything they could not take. I smiled and said nothing. I just waited for my uncle to place a single bank letter, dated 27 years earlier, on the table. My parents read the first line, and the room went dead silent. Before I share exactly how I legally dismantled their entire lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to burn toxic family ties to the ground. I am Claire, 34 years old, and my role in the family was decided long before I ever had a say in the matter. We were gathered around an obscenely large mahogany dining table in my parents' Connecticut suburb home. The air smelled of expensive roasted turkey sage stuffing and the underlying scent of entitlement that my mother Patricia and my father Richard carried with them everywhere. 21 extended family members were crammed into the formal dining room and the adjacent sitting area. Aunts, uncles, and cousins clinking crystal glasses and sharing exaggerated stories of their yearly successes. I sat near the end of the table, quietly cutting into my cranberry sauce, already mentally exhausted from hours of smiling through passive-aggressive comments about my career. I am the director of supply chain logistics at a major corporate firm, a position I earned through grueling 80-hour work weeks and relentless dedication. But to my family, I was just the unmarried workaholic who had nothing better to do than fund their emergencies. Whenever someone asked what I did, my mother would wave her manicured hand and say, "Claire works in shipping. It keeps her busy since she does not have a husband." They deliberately minimized my achievements to keep me exactly where they wanted me, beneath them, but useful enough to exploit. My younger sister Brittany sat across from me, 32 years old, and draped in a designer silk blouse that I had likely indirectly paid for through one of my parents' manufactured financial crises. Brittany was the undisputed golden child. She had never held a job for more than 6 months, always finding a reason to quit because the work was too stressful or the boss did not appreciate her vision. Yet her failures were always met with sympathy and open wallets, while my successes were met with demands for financial assistance. Beside her sat her husband Jamal, a hard-working architect who had always seemed out of place in our family's den of vipers. Jamal was a good man, an African-American guy from a humble background who had bought into the illusion my family projected, entirely unaware of the financial abuse happening behind closed doors. He loved Brittany and worked incredibly hard to provide for their 3 children, but my parents constantly made him feel like he was falling short. My father would make subtle microaggressions about Jamal, needing family assistance, masking his insults as generosity. They used money as a weapon to keep Jamal feeling indebted and to keep everyone exactly where they wanted them. The dull roar of multiple conversations came to an abrupt halt when my father tapped his silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound commanded immediate attention, a trick he had perfected over decades of running his business and our household with absolute authority. Richard stood up at the head of the table, his face flushed with wine and self-importance. He smoothed his expensive tailored vest and offered a wide, benevolent smile to the room. "I want to thank everyone for coming together this Thanksgiving," he began, his voice booming over the silent relatives. "Family is the most important investment a man can make. Your mother and I have spent our lives building a legacy, and we have decided it is finally time to implement our retirement strategy." I felt a slight tightening in my chest, a familiar warning sign, whenever my father used corporate terminology to discuss family matters. He gestured grandly toward my younger sister. Brittany beamed, sitting up straighter in her chair as if preparing to receive a crown. "As you all know, Brittany and Jamal have blessed us with 3 beautiful grandchildren," Richard announced. "They need space to grow, space to thrive. So Patricia and I have decided to officially hand over this estate to them by the end of the year." The table erupted in polite applause. Aunts and uncles murmured their approval, while Brittany dabbed at dry eyes, playing the part of the overwhelmed, grateful daughter to absolute perfection. Jamal smiled but looked down at his plate, shifting slightly. He had always been told that the family wealth would eventually trickle down to help with the kids, but giving them the entire estate outright seemed to catch even him off guard. I watched him swallow hard, clearly uncomfortable with accepting such a massive handout, but unwilling to cause a scene in front of the extended family. But Richard was not finished. He raised a hand to quiet the room, his eyes locking directly onto me. A cold, predatory glint appeared in his stare. Now downsizing is not really in our vocabulary, he chuckled, drawing a few sycophantic laughs from my uncles. We still want to host the holidays and maintain our standard of living. Fortunately, we have the perfect solution. Claire is 34 now, and since she is still stubbornly single and so focused on her logistics career, she has agreed to purchase a luxury 5-bedroom house in the new gated community across town. She will be making the down payment and carrying the mortgage, and your mother and I will be moving in there for our retirement. It makes perfect sense. Claire has no family of her own to provide for, so she can provide for us. The sheer audacity of the statement hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. 21 pairs of eyes shifted from my father to me, waiting for my reaction. The expectation in the room was palpable. They expected me to simply nod to accept this massive financial burden because that was what I had always done. I looked at my mother, Patricia, who was nodding along as if my father had just announced the weather forecast. She caught my gaze and offered a thin, condescending smile. It is the practical choice, Claire, my mother chimed in, making sure her voice carried to the back of the room. You have been hoarding your salary for years while living in that cramped downtown apartment. Brittany gave us a real family. The least you can do is ensure your father and I have a comfortable place to age gracefully. You owe your sister this much for carrying the family legacy while you focus on shipping containers. The gaslighting was so blatantly aggressive, it was almost breathtaking. They were framing the theft of my future as an act of familial duty. I glanced at Brittany, who gave a slight entitled shrug, completely comfortable with the idea of me financing our parents' lives so she could inherit a multi-million-dollar property for free. Jamal looked increasingly uncomfortable. His brow furrowed as he looked between me and my father. He was the only one who seemed to register the insane unfairness of demanding I buy a luxury home for my parents, but he had been fed so many lies by Brittany about our family dynamics that he stayed silent, trusting his wife's version of reality. My cousins were whispering among themselves, fully expecting me to fold. After all, bowing to their demands was the role I had played my entire life. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or throw my napkin down in a dramatic display of outrage. The time for emotional reactions had passed long ago, burned out of me through years of quiet manipulation. Instead, I sat perfectly still, feeling an icy calm wash over my entire body. I picked up my wine glass by the delicate crystal stem, swirled the deep red liquid for a moment, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The silence in the dining room stretched on, becoming thick and unbearable as they waited for my usual compliance. I set the glass down gently on the pristine white tablecloth, ensuring the base made a quiet but firm sound against the wood underneath. You are right about one thing, Dad, I said, my voice dangerously even, carrying clearly across the silent room. I am closing on a property next week. I saw a fleeting look of triumph cross my father's face, a smug satisfaction that his public pressure tactic had worked beautifully just as he planned. But I held his gaze without blinking, stripping away any warmth from my expression, and let my final words drop like heavy stones onto the fine china. However, there is only one name going on the deed, and it absolutely isn't yours. The silence that blanketed the dining room was absolute and suffocating. The only sound left in the massive space was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My father sat frozen at the head of the table. The smug, triumphant smile he had worn just seconds ago completely dissolved, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was my mother who broke the silence. Patricia pushed her chair back so violently it screeched against the polished hardwood floor. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle and the silverware vibrate against the china. Her face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. "You selfish brat!" Her voice started as a low, venomous hiss before escalating into a full-blown shout that echoed off the high ceilings. She looked around the table, weaponizing the presence of the extended family performing for her captive audience of aunts and uncles who sat wide-eyed over their half-eaten turkey. "How dare you sit at this table and disrespect your father after everything we have sacrificed for you? You act like you built your life entirely on your own. Have you forgotten who kept you off the streets? Do you all know who paid her rent when she was nothing but a struggling junior coordinator? We did. We kept a roof over her head when she was barely making enough to feed herself." She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her chest heaving with righteous indignation. I sat perfectly still, letting her words wash over me. She was referring to a single month of rent. 10 years ago, my roommate had broken our lease without warning, leaving me stranded and scrambling to cover the sudden expense on an entry-level logistics salary. I had asked my parents for a brief temporary loan of $1,500. It was the only financial assistance I had requested since the day I turned 18. Yet for an entire decade, they had treated that single check like a lifetime subscription to my bank account. They had used that one favor as the ultimate leverage, extorting thousands of dollars from me over the years to fund their manufactured emergencies and luxury whims. Patricia was not finished. She pivoted sharply, gesturing toward my sister. "And you have the nerve to sit across from Brittany and act superior. Brittany gave this family a legacy. She gave us 3 beautiful grandchildren while you hoarded your logistics salary like a dragon sitting on a pile of gold. Your sister is raising the future of this family. What have you done? You chose shipping containers over your own blood. You owe your sister. You owe us. The absolute least you could do is ensure your father and I have a respectable place to retire instead of acting like a greedy, ungrateful spinster." The sheer level of delusion required to deliver that speech was staggering. I looked across the table at Brittany. She was sitting back in her chair, a faint, self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She loved this. She thrived in the role of the beleaguered, underappreciated mother who deserved the world simply for existing. Beside her, Jamal shifted uncomfortably. His dark eyes darted between his wife and me, clearly deeply troubled by the escalating hostility. Jamal was a proud, hard-working architect. He had a strong moral compass, but he had been systematically fed a diet of carefully constructed lies since the day he married into our family. Brittany and my parents had convinced him that our family had an investment business that generated substantial dividends. He believed that the money funding his children's elite private school tuition and his wife's endless shopping sprees came from a legitimate family trust. He had no idea that he was sitting at a table funded entirely by the financial abuse of his sister-in-law. I could see the conflict in his posture. He leaned in and murmured something quietly to Brittany, attempting to de-escalate the situation, but she quickly brushed his hand away, refusing to break eye contact with me. The aunts and uncles murmured their agreement with my mother. In their eyes, Patricia was the aggrieved matriarch dealing with a rebellious, cold-hearted daughter. I was the villain in their heavily curated narrative. I did not raise my voice to match my mother's screaming. I did not offer a tearful defense or try to explain the truth to relatives who had already made up their minds. Panic and shouting were tools for people who lacked leverage. I had outgrown the need to explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I calmly reached into my designer blazer and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face as the facial recognition unlocked the device. The room watched me in tense anticipation as I tapped the banking application on my home screen. I navigated through the menus with practiced, deliberate precision. A struggling junior coordinator, I said, my voice cutting through the tension with icy clarity. "I remember that year vividly, Mom. I was working 60 hours a week building the foundation of a career you just dismissed as shipping containers. You wrote me a check for $1,500 because my roommate abandoned our lease. It was the only financial support you have ever provided in my adult life." I typed the numbers into the transfer screen. "You have spent 3,650 days holding that single favor over my head. You have used it to justify demanding emergency funds for Dad's bad investments. You have used it to force me to pay for Brittany's luxury vacations because she was too stressed from not working. You treated a minor loan like you purchased shares in my future. My thumb hovered over the final confirmation button on the screen. I locked eyes with my mother. I just wired $1,500 directly into your primary checking account. I spoke the words slowly, ensuring every syllable registered with the silent audience surrounding us. That covers the exact amount you helped me with a decade ago. I even rounded up to account for inflation and a highly aggressive interest rate. A soft ping echoed from my father's phone resting on the table next to his plate, confirming the incoming deposit. My mother stared at the device, the color draining slightly from her flushed cheeks as the reality of my actions settled in. I set my phone face down on the table next to my wine glass. I looked directly at my parents, stripping every ounce of familial warmth from my expression. The debt is paid in full. Do not ever claim I owe this family a single dime again. I will not be buying your retirement home. I will not be subsidizing my sister's lifestyle. My money belongs to me. The definitive nature of my statement hung heavily in the air. For years I had bent over backward to keep the peace. I had paid their bills, ignored their insults, and allowed them to diminish my achievements just to avoid this exact kind of confrontation. I had played the role of the dutiful, quiet daughter who was expected to write checks and remain in the shadows while the golden child soaked up the praise. But the demand for an entire house was the absolute limit. They had pushed too far, blinded by their own greed and accustomed to my endless compliance. Brittany scoffed, breaking the silence. She crossed her arms over her expensive silk blouse. You think throwing a few dollars at Mom changes anything? You are being completely unreasonable, Claire. We are a family. Families help each other out. We pool our resources. We do not pool our resources, Brittany, I corrected her sharply. You drain my resources. There is a massive difference. You have never contributed a single thing to the pool you claim we share. Jamal closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, the discomfort radiating from him. He hated tension, and the blatant toxicity of the exchange was clearly wearing on him. He looked at me with an expression that bordered on pleading, wanting the conflict to end. But this was no longer a disagreement that could be swept under the rug with polite apologies and forced smiles. The battle lines had been permanently drawn. My mother stood there, her chest heaving, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. She looked to my father, expecting him to deliver the final, crushing blow that would force me back into submission. Richard did not disappoint her. He slowly rose from his chair, leaning his heavy frame forward, his hands pressing flat against the polished wood. The initial shock had vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, arrogant certainty. He felt untouchable. He believed he held the ultimate trump card, a chain around my neck that I had completely forgotten about. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and malice, preparing to deliver the words he believed would break me entirely. Richard leaned his heavy frame across the table, bringing his face uncomfortably close to the roasted turkey sitting between us. The initial shock that had paralyzed him just moments ago was completely gone. In its place, a dark, bruised shade of purple crept up his neck and settled into his cheeks. It was the color of a man whose absolute authority had just been questioned in front of his entire kingdom. He let out a low, malicious laugh that scraped against the silence of the dining room. It was not a sound of amusement, but a deliberate, weaponized scoff designed to make me feel small. You actually believe you have a choice in this matter, Claire, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You sit there in your expensive blazer playing the role of the independent corporate executive, thinking you can just dictate terms to us. You think throwing $1,500 at your mother absolves you of your duty. He shook his head slowly, looking around the room to ensure every single aunt, uncle, and cousin was watching his display of dominance. You are nothing but a walking paycheck for this family. That is your purpose. That is your role. You do not have a husband. You do not have children. You have a logistics title and a bank account, and you will use both to ensure your sister and your parents are taken care of. You will never own anything we cannot take from you. The blunt cruelty of his words caused a physical ripple through the room. A few of the older aunts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none of them dared to speak up against him. My mother sat taller, visibly energized by my father putting me back in my designated place. Across the table, Brittany poured herself another glass of expensive red wine, a self-satisfied smirk firmly planted on her face. She was practically glowing, bathing in the validation that my money was ultimately her money. Only Jamal looked genuinely horrified. He stared at my father with wide, disbelieving eyes, his jaw slightly slack, as he finally witnessed the unmasked financial extortion that had funded his comfortable suburban life. He opened his mouth to say something to intervene, but Brittany quickly placed a manicured hand over his wrist, digging her nails in just enough to keep him silent. I did not break eye contact with my father. I let him bathe in his own arrogance, letting him believe that his harsh words had somehow stripped away my armor. I wanted him to feel absolutely invincible because it would make the impending fall so much more devastating. You see, Claire? My father continued, his tone shifting from aggressive to mockingly educational, as if he were explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. You are so busy managing supply chains that you forgot to manage your own life. You forgot that when you were 18 years old and heading off to college, your mother and I helped you open your primary checking and savings accounts at the local branch. We had to co-sign because you had no credit. We put our names on those accounts to protect you. And in all these years, as your corporate bonuses rolled in and your salary doubled, you never once thought to remove us. He paused, letting the weight of his revelations sink into the minds of the 21 relatives watching us. He was boasting. He was publicly bragging about holding the keys to my financial ruin. Legally speaking, that money is just as much mine as it is yours, he stated, a triumphant gleam lighting up his eyes. I do not need your permission to fund this retirement house. I do not need your signature on the wire transfer. You are going to buy that 5-bedroom property whether you want to or not. Tomorrow morning when the bank opens at 9, I am going to drive down to the main branch. I will sit at the desk of the branch manager I have known for 20 years, and I will personally authorize the wire transfer for the down payment. I will drain whatever is necessary to secure my future, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me. My father crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back with the supreme confidence of a man who had just delivered checkmate. My mother let out a small, breathless sigh of relief, smoothing her napkin over her lap, as if the unpleasant business of the evening had finally been successfully concluded. The extended family exhaled collectively, the tension dissipating as the natural order of our toxic hierarchy was seemingly restored. I looked at the faces around the table. I saw the greed, the complacency, the absolute disregard for my autonomy as a human being. They truly believed I existed solely to be mined for resources. For 34 years, I had internalized their demands. I had let them convince me that my worth was directly tied to my financial usefulness. But looking at my father's smug purple face, I felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. The daughter who desperately wanted their love was dead. The woman sitting at the table was just a CEO, dealing with a hostile takeover. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs gliding silently over the expensive Persian rug. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer with slow, deliberate movements. I did not rush. I did not show a single ounce of fear or panic. I reached over to the back of my chair and calmly picked up my tailored wool coat, draping it gracefully over my forearm. I looked at my mother, who was already cutting a piece of turkey, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just threatened to legally rob me. I looked at Brittany, who raised her wine glass in a silent, mocking toast. I looked at Jamal, who simply stared at his plate, looking utterly defeated by his proximity to this madness. Finally, I turned my attention back to my father. I gave him a dead, chilling smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a mechanical curving of the lips that did not reach my eyes. It was the exact smile I used across boardroom tables right before I decimated a competitor. I stopped at the threshold of the dining room, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to ensure every single person was hanging on to my next breath. I looked directly into my father's arrogant eyes, watching the supreme confidence radiating from his posture. You should really check that account balance before you try Dad. I did not wait to see his reaction. I turned my back on the 21 relatives and walked out the front door, stepping into the crisp, freezing Connecticut air, leaving them entirely to their delusions. Monday morning arrived with the biting chill of late November. At exactly 9 o'clock, Richard pushed through the heavy glass doors of the local bank branch. He wore his tailored wool coat and carried the absolute certainty of a man who owned the world. He bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly to the desk of the branch manager. Richard did not ask for an appointment. He simply sat down in the leather guest chair and slid his platinum identification card across the polished mahogany surface. He demanded an immediate wire transfer for a luxury home down payment, using the joint account he had forced Claire to keep open since she was 18. The manager smiled politely and tapped away at his keyboard. Richard leaned back, crossing his ankles, fully expecting the transaction to be completed in minutes. He had spent the entire weekend fuming over Claire's insolence at the Thanksgiving table. Her little dramatic exit had been annoying, but he was certain it was just a tantrum. She was a walking paycheck, and paychecks do not get to dictate terms. The manager stopped typing. He squinted at the computer monitor and adjusted his glasses. The polite professional smile vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of deep confusion. Richard tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest, demanding to know what the delay was. The manager cleared his throat, pulling at his collar, and turned the monitor slightly. He informed my father that there must be some kind of administrative misunderstanding. The account balance was exactly $0.00. Richard let out a sharp bark of laughter, telling the manager to refresh the system. He insisted there were hundreds of thousands of dollars in that account, representing a decade of Claire's hoarded corporate bonuses and logistics salary. He demanded the manager stop playing games and execute the transfer immediately. The manager shook his head, his face paling, as he pulled up the complete transaction history. He printed the ledger and slid it across the desk. He informed Richard that the account had been effectively empty for exactly 3 years. Every single cent from Claire's direct deposits had been automatically routed to a private offshore tiered trust the very moment it hit the ledger. The joint account was nothing but a hollow shell, a financial decoy left behind to make Richard believe he still held the leash. The color drained entirely from Richard's face. He snatched the printed statement from the manager's hands, his eyes scanning the endless rows of zero balances and automated transfer receipts. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Claire had not just rebelled at dinner. She had been actively deceiving them, smiling at family holidays, and playing the obedient daughter while systematically locking away every single asset she owned. The absolute control he thought he had was an illusion. The retirement house he had promised his wife in front of 21 relatives was completely unfunded. Richard stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the carpeted floor. He screamed at the manager, slamming his fists on the desk and demanding they reverse the transfers. He claimed fraud and asserted his rights as the joint account holder to access the funds. The manager calmly but firmly explained that as a joint owner, Claire had every legal right to withdraw her own funds and move them wherever she pleased. There was absolutely nothing the bank could do. The federal authorities, the police, and the bank's internal fraud department would only laugh at a father trying to report his adult daughter for legally moving her own paycheck into a private trust. Richard stormed out of the bank, his hands shaking with a toxic mixture of profound humiliation and raw, unadulterated fury. He sat in the driver's seat of his luxury sedan, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He dialed Patricia's number, breathing heavily as he waited for her to answer. The moment she picked up, he unleashed a torrent of rage. He told her the money was gone. He explained the offshore trust, the zero balance, and the 3 years of calculated, meticulous deception. Patricia gasped on the other end of the line, the sound quickly morphing into a vicious, unhinged shriek. "How dare she?" she screamed through the phone. "After everything we did for her, after we gave her life and raised her, she treats us like common thieves." The twisted logic of a narcissist was fully at play. In their minds, my refusal to let them steal my life savings was the ultimate act of betrayal. Patricia did not pause for a single second to reflect on her own actions or the extortion they had attempted. She immediately shifted her focus to retaliation. If Claire thought she could cut them off financially, they would hit her where it hurt the most. They would destroy the very career that gave her this newfound independence. Patricia told Richard to go home and handle the real estate fallout with the realtors, while she and Brittany took care of Claire. Brittany was sitting at the kitchen island drinking a matcha latte when Patricia slammed her phone down. My sister's eyes grew wide as she listened to the plan. Brittany had always harbored a deep-seated venomous jealousy of my corporate success. While she played the role of the perfect suburban mother, she secretly resented my financial freedom, the respect I commanded in the business world, and the fact that I did not have to rely on a spouse or parents to survive. The idea of tearing me down, of seeing me publicly fired and humiliated, was simply too tempting for her to resist. Brittany grabbed her designer purse and her car keys, a cruel, vindictive smile spreading across her face. "Let us go remind my sister who really runs this family," she said. They marched out to the car, united in their toxic mission. During the 20-minute drive to the downtown business district, they fed off each other's anger, escalating their own sense of victimhood. They rehearsed exactly what they would say to my superiors. They planned to claim I was mentally unstable and a danger to the workplace. They would say I was embezzling money from my own family and likely doing the exact same thing to the company. They wanted to create such a massive, chaotic scene that the firm's upper management would have no choice but to terminate me immediately just to protect their corporate reputation. They wanted me destitute, crawling back to the family home, begging for forgiveness, and ready to hand over whatever hidden trust funds I had created just to survive. The logistics firm occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the city's financial district. Patricia and Brittany strode through the heavy revolving doors with the absolute entitlement of royalty inspecting their subjects. Their high heels clicked aggressively against the polished marble floors of the expansive main lobby. They ignored the security turnstiles and marched directly up to the sprawling main reception desk. The receptionist, a young man in a sharp, tailored suit, looked up with a polite, professional smile. Patricia slammed her hand down on the elevated marble counter, demanding to speak to the regional director of operations or the head of human resources immediately. The receptionist blinked, taken aback by the sudden, unprovoked hostility. He politely asked for their names and inquired if they had a scheduled appointment with anyone on the executive floor. Brittany scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as if she were speaking to an absolute imbecile. "We do not need an appointment," she sneered, leaning over the desk. "We are Claire's family, and we are here to report a severe ethical violation. She is out of control, and your executive board needs to know exactly what kind of unstable thief they have working for them." The receptionist's fingers froze over his keyboard. He looked at them with a strange, unreadable expression. He politely informed them that he could not simply call down executive management without a verified appointment, and gently asked them to lower their voices as they were in a professional corporate environment. That was the absolute wrong thing to say. Patricia completely lost whatever thin, fragile grip she had on her sanity. She started screaming. Her voice echoed harshly off the soaring glass walls, turning the heads of every corporate employee, delivery courier, and visiting client in the massive lobby. She yelled that I was a fraud, that I was stealing from my own flesh and blood, and that the company would be held legally liable if they continued to employ a dangerous sociopath. Brittany joined in, pulling out her smartphone and threatening to record the entire interaction for social media. She shouted that the firm was harboring a criminal and that they demanded to see the person in charge before they called the local news stations to expose the company's hiring practices. Security guards in dark suits began to slowly converge on the reception desk, communicating quietly into their earpieces and forming a loose perimeter around the two screaming women. The scene was perfectly chaotic, exactly as my mother and sister had planned. They wanted maximum exposure. They wanted my professional reputation burned to ash in front of hundreds of witnesses. They stood their ground in the center of the beautiful lobby, demanding the highest authority in the building come down to answer for my continued employment. Patricia crossed her arms, a look of pure, venomous triumph settling on her face. She was entirely convinced she had won. She was certain that within minutes, a panicked mid-level manager would rush out of the elevator banks, apologize profusely for the disturbance, and drag me out of my office in a cardboard box. They wanted the person who owned the building. They wanted the absolute top of the food chain to come down and fire me on the spot. They just had no idea who that person actually was. The heavy revolving doors of the downtown corporate tower spun rapidly as Patricia and Brittany stormed into the sprawling glass-walled lobby. The towering marble columns and sleek modern architecture were designed to intimidate, but my mother and sister moved with the blind, destructive entitlement of a wrecking ball. The sharp, aggressive clicking of their designer heels echoed loudly across the polished floor, instantly drawing the eyes of suited professionals arriving for their morning meetings. They marched directly past the velvet ropes, bypassing the standard visitor queue, and planted themselves directly in front of the expansive obsidian reception desk. The receptionist, a seasoned professional in his late 20s, looked up with a practiced smile. He opened his mouth to ask for their names, but Patricia slammed her palms down onto the cold stone surface before he could utter a single syllable. She demanded to speak to the regional director of operations and the head of human resources immediately. Her voice was shrill, unhinged, and completely devoid of the polite suburban mask she usually wore. She announced to the entire lobby that she was here to report a dangerous, unstable employee who was actively embezzling funds from her own family. She insisted that if management did not come down this instant, she would call the local news stations and drag the company name through the mud for harboring a criminal. Brittany stood right beside her arms, crossed defensively over her chest, nodding in eager agreement. She pulled out her smartphone and held it up like a weapon, threatening to record the entire encounter. She sneered at the receptionist, telling him that her sister Claire was a mid-level shipping drone who desperately needed to be taught a lesson about corporate hierarchy and family loyalty. They were entirely convinced that within minutes they would have me dragged down to the lobby, sobbing and begging for my sad little job, while they dictated terms of my surrender. They wanted a public execution. They wanted me destitute, stripped of my title, and crawling back to the family estate to hand over whatever hidden trust funds my father had just discovered were missing. They did not notice the subtle shift in the lobby atmosphere. They did not see the receptionist briefly glance over their heads, his eyes widening in sudden deferential panic. Before the receptionist could press the silent alarm beneath his desk, the soft chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the vast space. The polished steel door slid open with a quiet hum. I stepped out into the lobby. I wore a pristine tailored charcoal suit, holding a sleek digital tablet, resting comfortably against my forearm. I did not rush. I walked toward the reception desk with slow, deliberate strides, projecting absolute, undeniable authority. Patricia spotted me, and her eyes widened in a volatile mix of triumph and absolute fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "There she is, the thief, the ungrateful little sociopath." She lunged forward, closing the distance between us, stopping just inches from my face. Her breath smelled of stale coffee and bitter rage. "You thought you could make a fool out of your father?" Patricia screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You thought you could hide your little offshore accounts and play games with our money. Richard is pressing charges. He is calling the federal authorities. But I told him I wanted to handle this first. I wanted to come down here and show your bosses exactly what kind of snake they are paying a salary to. You are going to lose everything today, Claire. Everything. You will be packing your desk into a cardboard box before noon, and you will be begging us to let you sleep in Brittany's basement." Brittany stepped up beside her mother, practically vibrating with malicious excitement. She looked me up and down, taking in my tailored suit with a sneer of pure disgust. "You really thought you were untouchable just because you work 80 hours a week?" Brittany mocked, her voice dripping with venom. "You are just a worker bee, Claire. A replaceable corporate drone. Mom is right. By the time we are done talking to human resources, you will be blacklisted from the entire logistics industry." You are going to learn what happens when you turn your back on the people who tolerate your miserable existence. Dozens of employees had stopped in their tracks, their coffee cups halfway to their mouths, staring in stunned silence at the spectacular breakdown happening in the center of the lobby. I stood perfectly still. I let them exhaust their breath. I let them empty every single threat, every vicious insult, every delusional fantasy they had spent the entire car ride dreaming up. I watched the veins pop in my mother's neck. I watched the ugly, jealous satisfaction contort my sister's face. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I just let them burn through their oxygen until silence slowly crept back into the space between us. When they finally stopped panting and waiting for my inevitable breakdown, I took a slow step forward. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing them to lean in to hear the words that were about to end their entire reality. "You are operating under a few critical misconceptions, Mom," I said, my tone perfectly measured as if I were conducting a quarterly review. First, I highly encourage Dad to call the federal authorities. I would love to watch him explain to the FBI why he feels entitled to his adult daughter's private earnings. Second, you cannot speak to the regional director or human resources about my employment status. Patricia scoffed, her face twisting into a hideous sneer. "And why is that? Because you think you are too important to be fired. Because you think you are immune to company policy." "No," I replied, my voice dropping to a dead whisper. "Because I am not an employee here anymore." Patricia blinked, her brow furrowing as her brain struggled to process the sentence. Brittany's mocking smile faltered slightly, her eyes darting between me and the receptionist, who was now standing at perfect attention behind the desk. I raised my hand and gestured broadly to the towering glass walls around us, to the massive digital screens displaying global shipping routes, and finally to the subtle new brass lettering etched into the wall behind the reception desk. "I orchestrated a leveraged buyout of this entire regional branch last month," I explained, speaking slowly so they could absorb every devastating syllable. "I used the capital from that offshore trust you are so angry about to purchase this building, the fleet contracts, and the entire coastal operation. Human Resources does not manage my employment. The regional director reports directly to my desk. I am the chief executive officer of this company." The color vanished from Patricia's face instantly. It was as if someone had pulled a plug, draining every ounce of blood and bluster from her body. Her jaw went slack, her eyes darting frantically around the lobby, suddenly noticing the terrified, deferential looks the other employees were giving me. She looked back at the brass lettering on the wall, seeing the subtle changes she had been too blind with rage to notice upon entry. Brittany physically stumbled backward, shaking her head in violent denial. "No," she stammered, her voice tight and breathy. "No, that is impossible. You just work in shipping. You are just a manager. You cannot own this. This is a multi-million-dollar firm. It is actually a multi-billion-dollar operation now." "Brittany," I corrected her smoothly, checking the time on my watch. "And you are currently trespassing in my lobby." Patricia's survival instinct suddenly kicked in. The narcissistic pivot was almost fascinating to witness. The absolute rage melted away instantly, replaced by a sickening, desperate greed. If I owned the company, then in her mind they owned the company. She reached out, her hands trembling, trying to grab my forearms. "Claire," she gasped, forcing a terrifying smile onto her face. "Claire, this is incredible news. You own the firm. Do you realize what this means for the family? We do not need the house down payment anymore. You can just give Brittany a vice president title. You can cut your father and me in on the profit sharing. We are your family. We are your blood. You owe us a stake in this. You owe us a..." The sheer repulsive entitlement made my skin crawl. They had just spent the last 10 minutes trying to destroy my life, and the moment they realized I held absolute power, they demanded the keys to the castle. I looked down at her hands hovering near my sleeves and took a deliberate step backward. "I did not owe you when I was a junior coordinator, and I certainly do not owe you a single corporate share today," I stated, my voice echoing like cracking ice. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers twice. The response was immediate. 4 heavily built security guards in dark, immaculate suits stepped out from the shadows of the marble columns. They had been standing by monitoring the situation, waiting for my exact signal. They moved with military precision, forming a tight, impenetrable wall around Patricia and Brittany. "Mr. Vance," I said, addressing the head of security who stood directly in front of my mother. "These two individuals are no longer welcome on company property. Please escort them out of the building. If they resist or attempt to re-enter, you have my full authorization to contact the police and press charges for criminal trespassing." Patricia screamed, thrashing wildly as 2 guards firmly gripped her upper arms and began marching her toward the revolving doors. "You cannot do this to me. I am your mother. I gave you life. You are a monster, Claire. You are a cold-blooded monster." Brittany was in absolute hysterics, sobbing uncontrollably as the security team guided her forcefully by the shoulders. She was crying about her reputation, begging the guards to let her go, claiming she had designer shoes that were getting scuffed. The entire lobby of professionals stood in dead silence, watching the golden child, and the abusive matriarch being perp walked out of the glass building like common criminals. I stood perfectly still, watching the heavy revolving doors spin as they were shoved out onto the freezing pavement. I adjusted the cuffs of my blazer, turning my attention back to the receptionist, who was staring at me with wide, terrified awe. "Hold all my calls for the next hour," I instructed him, my voice calm and completely untroubled. "My brother-in-law will be calling my private line shortly, and I need to ensure the connection is crystal clear." I walked back to the private executive elevator, leaving the stunned receptionist to process what he had just witnessed in the lobby. The smooth, rapid ascent to the top floor gave me a moment to relish the absolute silence. For the first time in my entire life, the chaotic noise of my mother and sister had been physically shut out. I stepped into my corner office overlooking the city skyline and sat behind the heavy oak desk. The transition from the obedient, silent daughter to the untouchable executive was finally complete. I opened my laptop, ready to review the quarterly projections, when the private line on my desk phone began to ring. Only a handful of people had that direct number. I glanced at the caller identification display. It was Jamal. I picked up the receiver, expecting to hear the usual panicked apologies he offered whenever Brittany crossed a line. Instead, his voice was hushed tight with an unfamiliar mixture of frustration and deep, profound confusion. He was clearly speaking from somewhere private, likely the garage or the driveway of his suburban home. "Claire, what is going on?" he asked without a standard greeting. "Brittany just came home in absolute hysterics. She is completely inconsolable. Patricia is pacing the living room, threatening to call her lawyers. They are saying you completely locked them out of the corporate accounts." I leaned back in my chair, resting my hand on the polished wood. "I did not lock them out of any corporate accounts, Jamal. I simply removed myself from a joint checking account they were planning to drain this morning." Jamal let out a heavy sigh, sounding like a man desperately trying to mediate a war he did not understand. "Claire, I know you are angry about the house situation. I know Richard pushed too far at dinner. But cutting off the family business dividends is just cruel. You cannot just freeze their income because you are upset. Brittany says you are trying to bankrupt us to prove a point. You know we rely on those quarterly distributions for the kids' school tuition. It is not fair to punish the children because you are mad at Richard." The words hung in the air. Family business dividends, quarterly distributions. For a fraction of a second, my brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the lie Jamal had just uttered. And then the final puzzle piece locked into place. The realization hit me with such force that I actually let out a short, sharp breath. Brittany had lied to him. She had lied to her own husband for their entire marriage. Jamal was a proud, hard-working architect. He paid the mortgage on their house. He covered their standard living expenses. But the luxury vacations, the designer handbags, the elite private school tuition for their 3 children, those required a completely different level of wealth. Brittany and my parents had crafted an elaborate fiction to explain the constant influx of cash. They had convinced Jamal that there was a lucrative family investment firm generating substantial quarterly dividends. They had used this imaginary business to protect Jamal's fragile ego while simultaneously keeping him entirely in the dark about where the money actually originated. He thought he was marrying into old money. He had absolutely no idea he was marrying into extortion. I felt a cold, calculating calm wash over me. I could have yelled. I could have listed every single wire transfer I had made over the last decade. But Jamal did not deserve my anger. He was just another victim of their relentless gaslighting. He was collateral damage in their desperate campaign to maintain a facade of generational wealth. Jamal. I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register. Listen to me very carefully. I want you to take a deep breath and hear exactly what I am saying. He stopped talking. The silence on the line was heavy, thick with sudden anticipation. There is no family business. I stated the words clipping through the air with surgical precision. There are no corporate accounts. There is no investment firm generating quarterly distributions. There never was. I could hear his breathing falter. What are you talking about, Claire? Brittany handles the trust distributions. Richard manages the portfolio. They have an entire financial strategy. I closed my eyes, picturing the towering house of cards my family had built right over Jamal's head. I was the financial strategy, Jamal. Me. Every single luxury vacation you took. Every designer dress Brittany brought home. The elite private school tuition for your 3 children. It was all funded entirely by my salary. My parents used a single favor from a decade ago to extort thousands of dollars from me every single month. They funneled my money directly into your bank account and called it a family dividend. They lied to you to preserve Brittany's pride because she refused to admit that her spinster sister was subsidizing her entire life. The silence that followed was absolute. I could practically hear the foundation of his marriage cracking. I could envision him standing in his driveway, staring at the house he thought he was providing for, running the numbers in his head, and realizing the math had never actually made sense. No, he whispered, his voice breaking. No, that cannot be true. Richard showed me the portfolio statements once. Forged, I replied instantly, or simply statements from my own accounts that they claimed were joint family assets. They put their names on my primary account when I was 18 and used it to monitor every dime I made. I drained that account 3 years ago when I started my own firm. Today, Richard tried to use that account to steal the down payment for a luxury retirement home. That is why they are hysterical. They did not lose their business dividends today, Jamal. They lost their hostage. Jamal let out a ragged breath, a sound of profound devastation. 10 years, he muttered, speaking more to himself than to me. She looked me in the eyes and lied for 10 years. Ask her. I instructed, my tone softening just a fraction. Go inside right now. Do not let her deflect. Do not let her scream or cry her way out of it. Look your wife in the eyes and ask her to produce a single legitimate tax document for this family business. Ask her where the money for the kids' private school really comes from. I did not wait for his response. I gently placed the receiver back onto the cradle, terminating the connection. I had planted the seed. The truth was a highly invasive root, and it would tear straight through the manicured lawn of Brittany's perfect suburban life by nightfall. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of intense productivity. Free from the constant hovering anxiety of my family's financial demands, I finalized 3 international shipping contracts and restructured our regional distribution network. I felt lighter, sharper, and utterly invincible. It was long past dark when I finally packed my briefcase. The city lights sparkled through the glass walls of my office, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Before leaving, I checked my personal cell phone. There was a single notification, a voice message from my father. I stood by the window looking out over the glowing grid of the city and tapped the screen to play the audio. I expected another barrage of empty threats, another desperate attempt to re-establish control. What I heard was the sound of a man who had completely abandoned reason. Richard's voice was low, rough, and trembling with a rage so dark it practically bled through the speaker. He was no longer shouting. He was speaking with the cold, terrifying calm of a man who felt he had been backed into a corner and was ready to burn the entire building down just to prove he owned the matches. "You think you are so clever, Claire," his voice hissed into my ear. "You think because you bought some shiny glass office and played games with bank accounts that you have actually won. You think you can turn Jamal against your sister and walk away without a scratch. You have no idea what you have just done. You have no idea what I am capable of doing to protect this family from your greed." He paused, drawing a heavy, ragged breath. I could hear the clinking of ice in a glass in the background. He was drinking, feeding his own delusions of grandeur. "You forgot your place," he continued, the venom dripping from every syllable. "You forgot who put a roof over your head. You think you are completely independent, but you are sitting in an apartment that belongs to me. You think you are so smart, but you forgot the details of your own living situation. That beautiful downtown condo you love so much, the one you pay rent on every month. You think you hold the lease. But your grandfather left that property to me in the family trust. I am the sole legal owner of that unit. You are nothing but a tenant on a month-to-month agreement." Another sharp intake of breath followed by a cruel, wet chuckle. "You want to play the ruthless CEO," he sneered. "Then let us talk about evictions. Since you want to cut off your family, since you want to steal from your mother and ruin your sister's marriage, I am exercising my rights as the landlord. I am legally evicting you from that condo. I have already contacted my attorneys. They are drafting the notice to vacate right now. I want you out on the street. I want you sleeping in a hotel. You have 30 days to pack your precious designer clothes and get out of my property. Let us see how powerful you feel when you do not even have a place to sleep." The message abruptly ended with a sharp click, leaving me standing alone in the quiet office. I lowered the phone, staring at the dark screen. Richard thought he had played the ultimate trump card. He believed he had found the one remaining chain attached to my ankle. He honestly thought the threat of losing my apartment would force me to surrender my company and my life savings to him. He was completely blinded by his own arrogance. I slipped the phone into my pocket and picked up my briefcase. I walked out of the office, a genuine, relaxed smile finally gracing my lips. Richard was right about one thing. My grandfather had originally purchased that downtown condo, but my father had been so busy plotting his retaliation that he forgot to check the public property records. He had no idea what I had been doing with my money for the last 3 years. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about real estate law. The heavy oak doors of Elise's corner office clicked shut, sealing out the muted hum of the prestigious downtown law firm. Elise was a wealth management attorney with a reputation that made corporate embezzlers lose sleep. She was meticulous, relentless, and entirely devoid of sentimentality when it came to protecting her clients' assets. I had hired her 3 years ago when I first began siphoning my income away from my parents' prying eyes. She was the architect of the offshore tiered trust that had just left my father staring at a zero balance. I walked over to the sprawling mahogany conference table and placed my smartphone on the polished surface. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I simply tapped the screen and played the voicemail Richard had left me the previous night. My father's voice filled the sterile, quiet room. The dark, gaslighting tone vibrated through the speaker as he boasted about his absolute control over my living situation. He threatened to evict me from the downtown condo, claiming my grandfather had left the property entirely to him. He promised to leave me sleeping on the streets within 30 days. Elise sat back in her leather chair, her expression completely impassive. She steepled her fingers together, listening to the absolute arrogance radiating from the audio file. When the voicemail ended with a sharp click, she did not offer sympathy. She offered strategy. "How long have you lived in the downtown property, Claire?" she asked, her voice calm and analytical. 5 years, I replied, taking a seat across from her. I moved in shortly after my grandfather passed away. Richard handled the entire estate. He told me the condo was rolled into a family trust that he exclusively controlled. He said he was doing me a massive favor by renting it to me directly. He claimed he was keeping the rent under market value to help me build my savings. Elise raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. And who exactly is the recipient of these monthly rent payments? I send a wire transfer on the first of every month to a property management company, I explained. It is called Wellington Holdings, LLC. Richard said it was the corporate entity the trust used to manage its real estate portfolio. I have been paying $3,500 a month for 60 months. Elise did not say another word. She turned her attention to her dual monitors. The rapid staccato clicking of her keyboard filled the silent office. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the screens as she accessed the county property appraiser's database and the state's corporate registry. For 3 minutes, the only sound was the clicking of keys and the soft hum of the city traffic far below us. Then Elise stopped typing. She let out a short, sharp breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. She pressed a button on her desk, and the heavy commercial printer in the corner of the room whirred to life, spitting out a thick stack of documents. Elise gathered the warm papers, aligned their edges with a sharp tap against the desk, and walked over to the conference table. She spread them out in front of me like a dealer laying out a winning hand of cards. "Your father is a very arrogant man, Claire," Elise said, her tone laced with a dangerous kind of amusement. "But more importantly, he is a very sloppy criminal." I looked down at the documents. The first page was the official state registry for Wellington Holdings, LLC. "Look at the managing members," Elise instructed, tapping her manicured fingernail against the paper. I leaned in. The sole managing member of the limited liability company was Richard. The registered agent was Patricia. The corporate address was my parents' suburban home. "They are the property management company." I murmured, the realization starting to form a cold knot in my stomach. "It gets significantly worse," Elise said, sliding the next document directly in front of me. "This is the official notarized property deed for the downtown condo you currently reside in." I pulled it directly from the county records. "Read the name of the legal owner." I stared at the heavy watermarked paper. My eyes locked onto the bold black ink printed across the center of the page. The breath completely left my lungs. The name on the deed was Claire. My name. "I own the condo," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Elise nodded slowly, leaning her hands flat against the table. "You have owned it for 5 years. Your grandfather never left that property to your father. He bypassed Richard completely. Your grandfather knew exactly how financially irresponsible and manipulative your parents were. He legally deeded the downtown condo directly to you upon his death. It was supposed to be your safety net. It was supposed to be a home you owned free and clear." The room seemed to spin slightly as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal crashed down over me. It was not just toxic family dynamics. It was not just aggressive emotional manipulation or narcissistic entitlement. This was a calculated felony-level scam perpetrated by the people who were supposed to protect me. "How did he do this?" I asked, my vision blurring slightly as I stared at my own name on the property deed. How did I not know I owned a $1 million piece of real estate? Elise pulled up a chair and sat directly next to me, sliding a third document onto the table. This was a copy of the lease agreement I had signed 5 years ago. "You were 29 years old and grieving the loss of your grandfather," Elise explained, her voice steady and grounding. "Richard was the executor of the general estate. He had absolute control over the flow of information during the probate process. When he presented you with the paperwork to finalize the estate matters, he buried this fake lease agreement in the stack of documents. He intercepted the official deed notification from the county and hid it from you. He immediately formed Wellington Holdings, LLC, to create a layer of corporate legitimacy. He essentially manufactured a fake landlord and handed you a lease for a property you already legally owned." I stared at my signature on the bottom of the fraudulent lease. I had signed it without a second thought. I had trusted my father. I had believed he was helping me secure a safe place to live in the city. "Let us look at the math." Elise said, her tone shifting into absolute predatory precision. "You have been paying $3,500 a month for 60 months. That is $210,000. He stole over $200,000 from you in fabricated rent payments. He used a shell company to siphon your income while threatening to evict you from your own home." A chilling, absolute silence enveloped me. The last lingering shred of daughterly guilt completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold-forged steel resolve. They had monetized my existence from every conceivable angle. They had charged me rent to live in my own house while simultaneously extorting my salary to pay for my sister's luxury lifestyle. They viewed me as nothing more than an ATM machine, an asset to be drained until there was absolutely nothing left. Elise picked up a red pen and began circling sections of the documents outlining the exact nature of the impending counterstrike. "Here is exactly what they have done, Claire," she stated, listing the offenses with ruthless efficiency. Theft by deception. They knowingly and intentionally created a fraudulent contract to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars from your accounts. Wire fraud. Every single time you authorized a bank transfer to Wellington Holdings, LLC across state lines, they committed a federal offense. There are 60 individual counts of wire fraud sitting right here on this table. Embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. As the executor of your grandfather's estate, your father had a legal obligation to inform you of your assets. He actively suppressed that information for personal financial gain. I looked up from the documents, meeting Elise's sharp, calculating gaze. Richard left a voicemail threatening to legally evict me. I said, my voice eerily calm. He said he contacted his attorneys to draft a 30-day notice to vacate. Elise smiled a genuine, terrifying smile. "That is the most beautiful part of his entire unhinged rant," she said, leaning back in her chair. "A landlord cannot evict the legal owner of a property. If Richard actually instructs his attorneys to file an official eviction notice with the housing court, he will be filing a fraudulent legal document. He will be committing perjury on public record. It elevates this entire situation from a quiet family dispute to a highly documented, aggressively prosecuted crime." "What is our next move?" I asked, picking up the fraudulent lease agreement and folding it neatly in half. "We let him file it," Elise replied instantly. "We do not warn him. We do not correct him. We let Richard walk straight into the courthouse and file the eviction paperwork. The moment that document is stamped by the court clerk, he locks himself into a trap he can never escape. While he is busy trying to throw you out on the street, I am going to freeze every single asset connected to Wellington Holdings, LLC. We are going to subpoena his personal bank records to track exactly where your $200,000 went." I stood up, smoothing the front of my suit jacket. My heart was no longer racing. The panic that had briefly threatened to consume me was entirely gone. I was standing on solid ground, armed with indisputable, highly illegal facts. "Draft the subpoenas." Elise, I instructed, my tone mirroring her absolute ruthlessness. "Track every single cent. I want to know exactly what my stolen rent money purchased. If it bought Patricia's jewelry, I want it flagged. If it bought Brittany's cars, I want them seized." "Consider it done," Elise said, gathering the documents and sliding them into a thick, secure folder. "Your father wanted a legal battle, Claire. We are going to give him a massacre." I walked out of Elise's office and stepped into the private elevator. As the door slid shut, I pulled out my phone and listened to Richard's threatening voicemail one more time. I listened to his arrogant chuckling, his absolute certainty that he held my life in the palm of his hand. He thought he was the architect of my destruction. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the blueprints to his own prison cell. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of Elise's building into the freezing evening air. The city felt entirely different now. The towering steel structures and glowing streetlights no longer felt like a backdrop to my grueling 80-hour workweeks. They felt like a kingdom I had rightfully conquered. Before I could signal for my personal driver, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my coat pocket. I anticipated another barrage of unhinged threats from Richard, but the screen displayed an encrypted text message from a number I had not seen in over a decade. The message was brief and completely devoid of pleasantries. It contained only an address for a 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city and a specific time. 10 o'clock tonight. Come alone. It was signed with a single initial. D. Uncle David. The absolute black sheep of the family. The man whose name was strictly forbidden at Patricia's immaculate holiday dinner tables. I told my driver to take the rest of the night off and hailed a standard yellow cab. I wanted this meeting to remain entirely untraceable. The diner smelled of burnt filter coffee, old frying oil, and harsh industrial bleach. It was a stark, abrasive contrast to the velvet-lined booths of the elite country clubs my parents frequented. I spotted Uncle David sitting in a cracked vinyl booth at the very back of the restaurant, facing the entrance. He looked weathered. His face was lined with years of hard manual labor, and his posture lacked the arrogant, polished stiffness that defined Richard. But his eyes were incredibly sharp, calculating, and entirely devoid of the pretentious fog that clouded the rest of my family. He was Richard's older brother, but they could not have been more different. I slid into the booth across from him. He did not offer a warm hug or fake familial greetings. He just pushed a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee across the laminate table toward me. "You stopped answering Richard's phone calls," David stated, his voice gravelly and direct. "Patricia called my ex-wife in absolute hysterics 2 hours ago, screaming that you had lost your mind and stolen the family business. Which means you finally woke up and figured out they are parasites." "I figured out they are committing wire fraud," I corrected, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee. "My attorney is preparing the federal subpoenas tomorrow morning. They have been running a shell corporation to extort fake rent payments from me for a condo I already legally own." David let out a low, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. He shook his head, staring into his own mug. "Wire fraud on a fake rental property is just child's play, Claire. Richard is a sloppy thief right now because he has been getting away with the perfect crime for 27 years. He thinks he is untouchable because nobody has ever challenged the foundation of his wealth." I set my mug down slowly. "What are you talking about?" He reached into the inside pocket of his worn leather jacket and pulled out a thick, yellowed manila envelope. The edges were frayed soft with age, and the paper smelled faintly of old dust and cedarwood. He placed it squarely on the table between us, his large, rough hands resting protectively over the seal. "They banished me from this family when you were 8 years old," David said, his gaze locking onto mine with an intense, burning clarity. "Patricia told all her high society friends that I had a severe gambling problem. Richard told you and Brittany that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. The truth is, I found out exactly what they did to your grandmother's estate, and I threatened to expose them to the authorities. They used their massive social connections to completely blackball me and run me out of town before I could secure a competent lawyer." I reached for the envelope, my fingers brushing against the fragile paper. I unclasped the metal string and slid the heavy contents onto the table. The first document was a faded bank letter stamped with a date from 27 years ago. The second was a thick, legally binding trust agreement bearing the gold-embossed seal of a highly prestigious wealth management firm that had long since merged with a global banking conglomerate. I scanned the heavy, dense legal jargon, my eyes darting across the paragraphs until I found the primary beneficiary designation. The breath completely hitched in my throat. The trust was established by my paternal grandmother, Eleanor. The principal funding amount was $4 million. The sole exclusive beneficiary was Claire Elizabeth Vance, me. There was absolutely no mention of Richard, there was no mention of Patricia, and there was certainly no mention of Brittany. The entire $4 million fortune had been left exclusively to a 7-year-old girl. "Your grandmother saw right through Richard's polished facade," David explained, leaning forward over the table, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She knew Patricia was fiercely obsessed with maintaining social status, and she knew Richard lacked the actual business acumen to maintain it. She also saw exactly how they treated you. Even at 7 years old, it was painfully obvious you were the designated scapegoat, while Brittany was paraded around their friends like a prize pony. Your grandmother wanted to ensure you had absolute, undeniable financial independence the second you turned 25. But I never received a single legal notification," I whispered, staring at the staggering numbers printed on the faded bank letter. "I turned 25 10 years ago. I was working 60-hour weeks at a junior logistics desk just to pay off my crippling student loans. I ate ramen noodles in a studio apartment while Brittany bought a new luxury SUV. Where did the money go?" David reached over and tapped a third document sitting at the very bottom of the pile. It was an old court-stamped guardianship affidavit. They did not steal the principal, Claire. The trust was drafted by the best lawyers in the state. It was locked up far too tight for Richard to just liquidate the $4 million and walk away. But they found a legal loophole. They forged guardianship documents claiming you were mentally unfit to manage your own finances as a minor. And later they extended it by claiming you had severe psychological instability as a young adult. They manipulated a corrupt family court judge who owed Richard a massive political favor to grant them permanent legal conservatorship over the trust's annual yield. The math rapidly calculated in my head, executing the brutal reality of my existence. A $4 million principal locked in high-yield index funds and conservative commercial real estate investments over a 27-year period. The interest alone would generate hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in pure passive income. My hands began to shake slightly, not from sadness, not from grief, but from an absolute seismic world-ending rage. Every single designer dress Brittany wore in high school. The extravagant European vacations Patricia constantly bragged about at her garden parties. The luxury vehicles Richard leased every 2 years to impress his golf buddies. Brittany's lavish $250,000 wedding that they claimed had drained their humble life savings. It was all paid for by my grandmother's trust. They did not just favor Brittany. They literally used my money to fund her golden child existence. They forced me to wear her discarded hand-me-downs and take out massive student loans while they siphoned the massive interest off my $4 million inheritance to build a completely fake empire of generational wealth. They had called me a corporate drone. They had called me a failure. They had mocked my work ethic at every single Thanksgiving dinner while secretly surviving entirely on the cash generated by my name. I managed to steal these copies from Richard's home office right before they cut me off. David continued, his voice low and steady. I held on to them for decades, waiting for the day you finally woke up and realized exactly who they really were. I saw the news about your logistics company buyout last month. I knew you finally had the capital and the power to crush him. But you need to be careful, Claire. If you try to confront them with this without preparation, Richard will claim the conservatorship was entirely legal. He will say he was aggressively investing the yield for your future to protect you from yourself. I looked up from the faded documents, the ambient clattering noise of the diner fading completely into a dead silence. He cannot claim he was investing it for my future when Elise subpoenas the financial records and proves he funneled the cash directly into his own shell companies and Brittany's luxury lifestyle, I stated, my voice turning into forged ice. He charged me rent to live in a condo my grandmother bought for me. He stole my inheritance to pay for my sister's sickening entitlement. He used my own money to buy the velvet ropes he used to keep me out of his life. I gathered the fragile documents and carefully placed them back inside the manila envelope, securing the metal clasp with absolute finality. I had walked into this diner thinking I was going to ruin their fake corporate structure and teach them a lesson about boundaries. Now the objective had entirely shifted. I was not just going to stop them from stealing my current income. I was going to force them to pay back every single cent they had spent over the last 27 years. I was going to legally dismantle their entire lives and leave them with the exact amount of money they had actually earned. Nothing. I looked across the chipped laminate table at Uncle David. He was watching me with a faint, proud smile illuminating his weathered face. He knew exactly what kind of monster he had just unchained. "Thank you, David," I said, sliding a crisp $100 bill onto the table to cover his black coffee. "Keep your phone on. When my legal team files the federal grand theft and fraud charges tomorrow morning, I want you sitting right beside me in the front row of the courtroom." The freezing wind whipped across the dark industrial street as I watched Uncle David pull his battered truck out of the diner parking lot. His taillights faded into the night, leaving me alone on the sidewalk, with the heavy manila envelope clutched tightly against my chest. I hailed a passing cab and sank into the vinyl back seat. The streetlights washed over the interior in rhythmic flashes, but my mind was completely consumed by the staggering numbers printed on those 27-year-old documents. $4 million. A forged medical conservatorship. A lifetime of my parents treating me like a burden while secretly feeding off my stolen inheritance like absolute parasites. My phone vibrated violently against my leg, pulling me out of my dark, calculating thoughts. I checked the screen. It was not Richard calling to scream another threat. It was a text message from Jamal. "I need to see you. Tonight. Name the place." I gave him the address of a quiet 24-hour coffee shop located in the financial district, halfway between my corporate office and his suburban home. When I arrived 20 minutes later, Jamal was already sitting in a dimly lit corner booth. He looked completely wrecked. His usually immaculate posture was gone. He sat hunched over the table, staring into a paper cup of black coffee with hollow, bloodshot eyes. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. I slid into the booth across from him. He did not say a word at first. He simply reached into his leather messenger bag and pulled out a thick, heavy ledger bound in dark green leather. He placed it squarely on the table between us. "You told me to ask her about the tax documents," Jamal said, his voice ragged and completely devoid of its usual warmth. "You told me to ask where the money for the kids' private school really came from." I did. I walked straight into the house and I asked her. She completely panicked, Claire. She tried to deflect. She cried. She screamed that I was being abusive and paranoid. She locked herself in the master bathroom and threatened to call Patricia. Jamal took a slow, shaky breath, rubbing his hands over his tired face. "I knew right then that you were telling the truth," he continued. "I knew my wife was lying to me. So I waited until she finally took a sleeping pill and passed out. Then I went into her home office and I cracked the code on her personal safe. I found this." I pulled the green ledger across the table and opened the thick cover. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten entries and printed bank transfer confirmations clipped to the margins. It was a master record of Brittany's entire financial life. I traced my finger down the columns. There were the monthly rent extortions they had squeezed out of my salary, labeled as family portfolio dividends. But right beside them were massive six-figure transfers coming from a completely different offshore account. I recognized the account routing number instantly. It perfectly matched the trust fund documents Uncle David had just handed me an hour ago. "This is the entire paper trail," I murmured, my eyes scanning the devastating evidence. "This outlines every single dollar they stole from my grandmother's trust. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the down payments on your house." Brittany kept a perfect, unredacted record of her own embezzlement. Jamal let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "She kept it because she is obsessed with tracking her net worth. She wanted to know exactly how much richer she was than her friends. But that is not the worst part, Claire. Do you know what makes me sick to my stomach? Do you know why I took that ledger and walked straight out the front door?" He leaned across the table, his dark eyes burning with a sudden, intense fury. "For 10 years, Richard treated me like a charity case," Jamal whispered, the anger trembling in his jaw. "Every single time we went to one of his elite country club dinners, he would pat my shoulder in front of his wealthy friends. He would make these subtle, condescending remarks. He would say how proud he was to support us, because my architecture firm was just a humble little business. He made these quiet, racially coded comments, implying that a man from my background could never properly provide for a woman of Brittany's social standing. He made me feel like I owed him my manhood because he was supposedly dipping into his generational wealth to put my kids through private school." Jamal struck the table with a closed fist, making the coffee cups rattle. "He used your stolen money to fund my life so he could play the benevolent white savior," Jamal stated, his voice laced with pure disgust. "He stripped me of my pride as a husband and a father while using me as a pawn to hide his own financial crimes. I sat at his dinner table for a decade, thanking him for his generosity while he was actively destroying your life. I am done, Claire. I am completely done. Take the ledger. Give it to your lawyers. I want you to burn their entire empire to the ground." I looked at the heartbroken, furious man sitting across from me. Jamal had always been kind to me. He had always tried to buffer Brittany's cruelty. He did not deserve the absolute nightmare my family had dragged him into. "I will make sure your children are protected," Jamal, I promised, sliding the ledger into my bag right next to Uncle David's envelope. But Richard and Patricia are going to lose absolutely everything. Jamal nodded slowly, standing up from the booth. Do it, he said, his voice cold and final. I am taking the kids to my mother's house in the morning. Brittany can figure out how to survive on her own. The next 3 days were a blur of ruthless legal preparation. I sat in Elisa's corner office matching the transactions in Brittany's green ledger to the trust fund withdrawal records Uncle David had provided. The puzzle was complete. We had the smoking gun. Elise drafted the federal grand theft subpoenas, the wire fraud indictments, and the civil asset forfeiture requests. We built a legal guillotine designed to sever Richard's financial head the moment it dropped. On the fourth morning, my private secretary walked into my office carrying a thick cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with heavy gold wax bearing the Vance family crest. This arrived by private courier 10 minutes ago, Miss Vance, my secretary said, placing it carefully on my desk. I dismissed her and broke the wax seal. Inside was a formal, heavy cardstock invitation printed in elegant calligraphy. It was from Patricia. You are hereby required to attend a formal family estate planning dinner this Friday at 7 o'clock in the evening. Legal counsel and medical advisors will be present to discuss the immediate future of the Vance family assets. Attendance is absolutely mandatory. I stared at the invitation, a cold smile slowly spreading across my face. I picked up my office phone and dialed Elise's direct extension. She answered on the first ring. Patricia just sent me a formal invitation to an estate planning dinner, I told Elise, reading the precise wording over the phone. She explicitly noted that legal counsel and medical advisors will be present. Elise let out a sharp, clinical laugh. He is making his move, Claire. Richard realized you cut off the regional bank accounts, and he knows you hold the title to the downtown condo. He feels his control slipping, so he is going for the nuclear option. What is the play? I asked, turning the thick cardstock over in my hands. He is going to try to reinstate the medical conservatorship, Elise explained, her voice humming with predatory excitement. He forged documents claiming you were mentally unfit 27 years ago to steal your trust fund. Now that you have real capital and your own corporation, he plans to do it again. He is gathering his corrupt doctors and his pocket lawyers at the family estate. He wants to corner you at dinner, provoke a reaction, and declare that you are suffering from severe paranoia and psychological instability. If he can force a medical conservatorship over you, he gains immediate legal control over your logistics company, and he permanently locks down the stolen trust fund. He is planning an ambush. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, watching the city move far below me. Richard thought I was still the obedient, terrified daughter who would shrink under the pressure of his authority. He thought bringing doctors and lawyers to a dining room table would intimidate me into surrendering the keys to my kingdom. He was setting a trap for a mouse, but he had no idea he was dealing with a predator. What do you want me to do? Elise asked, waiting for my command. I pulled a sleek black pen from my desk drawer and pulled the RSVP card toward me. File the federal indictments on Friday afternoon. At exactly 4 o'clock, I instructed, my voice turning into smooth, polished glass. Freeze the Wellington Holdings shell accounts at 4:15. Execute the property seizures on Brittany's luxury vehicles at 4:30. I want their entire financial reality completely demolished by the time I walk through their front door. I pressed the tip of the pen against the thick cream paper of the RSVP card. I am going to this dinner, I said, writing my response with slow, deliberate strokes. And I am going to let Richard stand up and make his little speech before I hand him a copy of his own federal indictment. I sealed the RSVP card in the return envelope. The message I wrote across the elegant paper was exactly 5 words long. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The iron-wrought gates of the Vance family estate swung open with a smooth mechanical hum, welcoming my hired town car up the sprawling circular driveway. The property was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. Towering stone columns supported a wraparound veranda, and immaculate landscaping stretched out beneath soft ambient uplighting. I stepped out of the vehicle and looked up at the massive structure. For years, this house had represented everything I was excluded from. Tonight, it represented a crime scene. Every imported brick, every manicured hedge, every crystal chandelier glowing through the bay windows had been paid for by my stolen inheritance. I handed my coat to a uniformed attendant and walked into the grand foyer. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered food and Patricia's suffocating floral perfume. The ambient noise of 21 extended family members mingling in the formal living room echoed off the marble floors. These were the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had spent decades ignoring my existence while attending lavish parties funded entirely by my grandmother's trust. They were here tonight for a spectacle. Patricia had billed this gathering as a critical summit regarding the future of the Vance family assets. I walked into the formal dining room just as the caterers were filling the crystal water glasses. The dining table was an enormous stretch of polished mahogany set with antique silver and bone china. Richard sat at the absolute head of the table, radiating the practiced, arrogant authority of a patriarch holding court. Patricia fluttered around him, playing the role of the exhausted but dedicated matriarch. Brittany was seated to his right, nursing a glass of red wine. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her posture was unusually stiff. Jamal is noticeably absent, Aunt Martha commented, taking her seat across from Brittany. I hope everything is all right with the children. Brittany forced a tight, unconvincing smile. Jamal had a sudden architectural emergency at one of his commercial sites. She lied, her voice carrying a slight tremor. He had to take the kids to his mother's house so he could manage the crisis. He sends his prayers for our family tonight. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table directly opposite Richard. I did not say a word. I simply unfolded my linen napkin and placed it on my lap. I knew exactly where Jamal was. I knew exactly why Brittany looked like she was teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown. But I kept my expression perfectly smooth, composed, and entirely unbothered. The first two courses of the dinner were served in an atmosphere of suffocating tension. The usual loud, boisterous bragging that defined my family gatherings was entirely absent. The relatives kept casting nervous sideways glances in my direction, waiting for the supposed erratic behavior Patricia had warned them about. I ate my salad in total silence, savoring the exquisite irony of eating a meal paid for by a man whose bank accounts had been frozen by federal order exactly 3 hours ago. As the caterers cleared the salad plates, Richard tapped his silver knife against his crystal water glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the low murmurs, instantly silencing the room. The hired staff immediately stepped out of the dining room, closing the heavy wooden doors behind them. We were entirely alone. Richard stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick, heavy leather folder, dropping it squarely onto the table with a loud thud. He looked down the length of the mahogany table, locking his eyes directly onto mine. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly, deeply sorrowful. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. Family. Richard began, his voice thick with manufactured grief. We are gathered here tonight under incredibly difficult circumstances. As the head of this family, it is my primary duty to protect our legacy, our assets, and above all else, our loved ones. Even when those loved ones are entirely incapable of protecting themselves. A low murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the seated relatives. Patricia reached up and dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Over the last few weeks, Patricia and I have witnessed a terrifying decline in Claire's mental stability. Richard continued, adopting the tone of a heartbroken father. We have tried to handle this privately. We have tried to give her the space and support she needs to manage her high-stress corporate environment. But her behavior has escalated from simple career burnout to severe, dangerous paranoia. He opened the heavy leather folder and pulled out a stack of documents, holding them up for the table to see. She has become completely unmoored from reality, Richard stated, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She is suffering from aggressive delusions regarding our family finances. She recently broke into the corporate accounts and attempted to sever the family business dividends that pay for her own niece and nephew's education. She has been making wild, unsubstantiated claims about owning property that has been in the Vance family trust for decades. She is actively attempting to bankrupt this family out of pure delusional spite. Brittany let out a loud theatrical sob, burying her face in her hands. Aunt Martha gasped, covering her mouth, while the rest of the extended family stared at me in horrified pity. I sat perfectly still. I did not break eye contact with Richard. I did not defend myself. I let him dig the hole as deep as his arrogance would allow. Because of this rapid psychological deterioration, I have been forced to make the hardest decision a father can make, Richard announced, placing his hand flat against the legal documents. I have consulted with the top medical advisors and psychiatric professionals in the state. I have spoken with our legal counsel. They have reviewed her recent erratic actions and her complete detachment from financial reality. For her own good, and for her own physical and financial safety, Patricia and I are filing an emergency petition with the state court tomorrow morning. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table, his eyes gleaming with absolute malicious triumph. We are reinstating a full involuntary medical conservatorship over Claire and all of her associated assets, Richard declared. We will be taking immediate executive control of her logistics firm, her personal bank accounts, and her residential leases. She is mentally unfit to manage a multi-million-dollar corporation. She requires intensive psychiatric intervention, and we are going to ensure she gets the help she desperately needs, even if she hates us for it. The dining room erupted into a chorus of hushed whispers and sympathetic sighs. Uncle James shook his head, murmuring about the tragic pressures of corporate life. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed Richard's hand, projecting the image of a united grieving couple forced to take drastic measures to save their broken daughter. They had orchestrated the perfect ambush. They had isolated me in a room full of witnesses, presented a fabricated medical narrative, and publicly stripped me of my autonomy under the guise of parental love. Richard stood at the head of the table, waiting for the inevitable explosion. He was waiting for me to scream. He was waiting for me to throw my glass, to deny his claims, to completely lose my temper, and provide the exact erratic performance he needed to justify his fake medical documents to the rest of the family. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not even shift my posture in the antique dining chair. I slowly reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen, illuminating the digital clock. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. Elise had executed the final phase of the asset seizure 45 minutes ago. The federal warrants were officially active. The trap had entirely closed. I picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate and looked directly down the table at the man who had stolen 27 years of my life. "Are you completely finished, Richard?" I asked, my voice dropping to a register so cold and utterly devoid of emotion that the entire dining room instantly fell dead silent. Richard's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected hysteria. He had absolutely no defense against pure, calculating silence. "This is exactly the delusion the doctors warned us about, Claire," he countered quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. "You think you can just dismiss a legal intervention. We have the medical affidavits. We have the court petition. You do not have a choice in this matter." I did not respond to his threats. I simply raised my right hand, resting my elbow on the arm of my chair, and gave a sharp, deliberate two-finger gesture toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the dining room. The silence in the room stretched for 2 agonizing seconds. And then the doors swung open. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the formal dining room did not just swing open. They crashed outward, hitting the custom wallpapered walls with a violent, deafening thud that rattled the crystal chandeliers overhead. The 21 seated relatives collectively jumped. Aunt Martha dropped her wine glass, sending a spray of dark red burgundy across the pristine white linen tablecloth. The sudden shattering of crystal was the only sound in the room, as every single head turned toward the threshold. Uncle David stood in the doorway. He was a stark, jarring contrast to the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns surrounding the table. He wore a faded canvas jacket, scuffed work boots, and a simple denim shirt. He did not look like a man who belonged in a multi-million-dollar estate, but his posture radiated an immovable, unshakable authority. He looked exactly like a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to burn. Patricia was the first to react. She sprang to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. Her face flushed a dangerous, mottled crimson. "How did you get in here?" Patricia shrieked, her carefully cultivated high society accent entirely abandoned. "You are not welcome in this house, David. You have not been welcome here for 27 years. I am calling security right now." David did not even look at her. He stepped into the dining room, his heavy boots leaving faint traces of outside dirt on the polished marble. He locked his eyes entirely on Richard. "Your security guards at the front gate are under investigation by federal agents as of 20 minutes ago," David stated, his gravelly voice carrying effortlessly across the cavernous room. "And your personal gate code is still the year our father died, Richard. You always were completely unimaginative." Richard stood up, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. He tried to project the image of a calm, commanding patriarch, but a faint sheen of sweat had already broken out across his forehead. He looked at the 21 relatives watching the scene unfold and immediately fell back on his favorite weapon: character assassination. "David, you are sick," Richard said, using the exact same tone of fake sorrow he had just weaponized against me minutes prior. "We all know about your gambling addictions. We all know about your paranoid delusions. You need to leave before you embarrass yourself further. I will not have you terrifying my guests." "I have never placed a bet in my entire life, Richard," David replied, taking slow, deliberate steps down the length of the dining table. "But you bet your entire reputation on the assumption that you could run me out of town and I would stay quiet forever. You bet that I would not spend the last 2 decades watching your every move. You lost." The extended family shrank back in their chairs as David walked past them. Nobody dared to intervene. The air in the dining room was thick and suffocating heavy with the electric tension of decades-old secrets threatening to break the surface. Patricia grabbed her phone from the table, her fingers trembling with rage. "You are a disgrace to the Vance name," she spat, her voice vibrating with venom. "You are a bitter, broke old man who could not handle the fact that Richard built an empire while you ended up with nothing." David stopped walking. He turned his head slowly to look at Patricia. "Richard did not build an empire," Patricia, David said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "Richard built a parasitic shell corporation. He is not a businessman. He is a thief who stole from a 7-year-old girl. And the only reason you married him was because you lacked the intelligence to verify where the money was actually coming from." Patricia gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if she had been physically struck. Several of the aunts murmured in shock, but David ignored them, turning his attention back to his brother. He closed the final distance, stopping directly at the head of the table. He towered over Richard. Richard tried to hold his ground, puffing out his chest. "You are trespassing. I am calling the police. You are going to be arrested for breaking and entering." "Call them," David challenged, crossing his arms over his chest. "Call the police, Richard. In fact, I insist. Let us get law enforcement in this room right now. It will save the federal marshals a trip tomorrow morning." Richard hesitated. His hand hovered over his phone, but he did not pick it up. He was terrified, and the entire extended family could see it. The confident, untouchable patriarch was suddenly sweating, freezing under the gaze of the brother he had banished. David reached into the inside pocket of his weathered canvas jacket. He pulled out the thick, frayed manila envelope. The edges were yellowed with age, completely out of place among the fine bone china and polished silver covering the table. With a swift, fluid motion, David dropped the envelope directly onto Richard's pristine dinner plate. It landed with a heavy, solid smack right on top of the fake medical conservatorship documents Richard had just proudly displayed to the room. "Open it," David commanded. Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. He did not move. He did not blink. "I am not entertaining the delusions of a deranged man," Richard said, his voice finally cracking. "Get this garbage off my table." He moved to sweep the envelope onto the floor, but I stood up from my chair at the far end of the room. My movement drew the attention of every single relative. "Open the envelope, Richard," I instructed, projecting my voice clearly and calmly across the space. You brought all 21 members of our extended family here tonight specifically to discuss the legal future of the Vance assets. You wanted complete transparency regarding my financial stability. You demanded a public intervention. So let us be completely transparent. Open the envelope and show the family what is inside. Aunt Martha, who had always been the most perceptive and ruthless gossip in the family, leaned forward in her chair. Her eyes darted from the yellowed envelope to Richard's sweating face. Yes, Richard. Aunt Martha chimed in her tone sharp and demanding. You invited us here to review documents, so let us review them. What is the manila envelope? Richard looked around the table. He was entirely trapped. His own sister was demanding answers. His banished brother was blocking his exit. And I was standing at the opposite end of the room watching him suffocate under the weight of his own hubris. With visibly trembling hands, Richard reached out and unclasped the metal string of the manila envelope. He slid the contents out. The heavy, legally bound trust agreement spilled onto his dinner plate alongside the faded bank letter bearing the seal of the global banking conglomerate. Read the first line, Richard David ordered, his voice echoing like a judge delivering a final sentence. I do not have my reading glasses, Richard deflected, trying to shove the papers back into the envelope. This is nonsense. This is a forgery. Read the first line, David repeated, slamming his rough hand down onto the mahogany table, making the silver cutlery jump. Read it out loud to your family. Richard swallowed hard. His chest heaved as he picked up the primary trust document. He stared at the faded ink. I watched his eyes track across the first paragraph. I watched the exact second his brain processed the legal text. The color vanished from Richard's face in an instant. His skin turned a sickening ashen gray. His jaw went completely slack, and his hands began to shake so violently that the thick parchment paper rattled audibly in the quiet room. Read it, Claire demanded, stepping away from my chair and walking slowly down the side of the long dining table. Read it, so Brittany can hear exactly who funded her entire existence. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips moved silently. Fine, David sneered, snatching the document out of his brother's trembling hands. I will read it for you. David cleared his throat and held the paper up to the light of the crystal chandelier. This irrevocable trust is hereby established by Eleanor Vance. David read, his voice projecting loud and clear to every corner of the room. The principal funding amount of $4 million is placed in high-yield conservative index funds. The sole exclusive and permanent beneficiary of this trust and all its generated interest is Claire Elizabeth Vance. David paused, letting the staggering dollar amount echo in the minds of the seated relatives. He looked directly at Patricia, who was gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled panic. Furthermore, David continued reading from the official document. Under no circumstances shall Richard Vance or Patricia Vance be granted access to the principal balance or the annual yield. The funds are to be held in strict confidence until Claire Elizabeth Vance reaches her 25th birthday, at which point she assumes total sovereign control of the entire estate. David lowered the paper. He tossed it back onto the table. There is no mention of a shared family business, David stated, looking around at the stunned faces of the aunts and uncles. There is no mention of a generational wealth portfolio. There is absolutely no mention of Brittany. Every single dollar this family has spent for the last 27 years belongs exclusively to Claire. The dining room went entirely dead silent. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum of sound. No one shifted in their chairs. No one whispered. The clinking of glasses and the rustle of expensive fabrics ceased completely. The 21 extended family members sat frozen, staring at Richard with a mixture of dawning horror and absolute disgust. They were doing the math in their heads. They were calculating decades of lavish parties, private schools, and luxury vehicles against the staggering reality that their patriarch had stolen it all from an orphaned child. Brittany broke the silence. She stood up so fast, her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. That is a lie, Brittany shouted, pointing a trembling manicured finger at the document. That does not make any sense. Where is my name? Where is my trust fund? Grandma Eleanor loved me. She would never leave everything to Claire. You do not have a trust fund, Brittany, I said, finally reaching the head of the table and standing right beside Uncle David. You never did. You have never had a single dollar to your name that you did not steal from me. Brittany stared at me, her eyes wide with frantic denial. Dad, tell her she is lying. Tell them this is a fake. Richard did not look at her. He could not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to his empty dinner plate, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The invincible patriarch was completely broken, stripped of his armor, and exposed as nothing more than a common thief. The silence in the dining room was absolute, a suffocating vacuum that pressed against the walls of the lavish estate. The invincible patriarch was completely broken, stripped of his armor, and exposed as nothing more than a common thief. Richard stared blankly at the faded parchment resting on his dinner plate, his mind visibly short-circuiting as the reality of his total destruction began to set in. He could not look at Uncle David. He certainly could not look at me. He just sat there, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had dictated my entire existence. Patricia, however, possessed a deeply ingrained survival instinct entirely based on social preservation. She could not process the truth, so she immediately rejected it. She sprang to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the imported Italian marble floor. Her manicured hands trembled violently as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles stark white. "This is a sick, orchestrated joke," Patricia shrieked, her perfectly cultivated high society accent completely disintegrating into raw, panicked hysteria. She looked wildly around the room at the 21 stunned relatives desperate to corral her audience. David is a bitter, banished drunk, and Claire is severely mentally unwell. They forged these documents to humiliate us. We gave this ungrateful girl a home. We fed her, we clothed her, we protected her from her own instability. And this is how she repays us. I took a slow, deliberate step away from my chair at the far end of the room. The sharp click of my heels against the marble echoed like a metronome counting down their final seconds of relevance. I did not shout. I did not need to match her manic energy. I simply let the absolute weight of my calm authority fill the space. You did not raise a difficult daughter, Patricia, I stated, my voice dropping to a register of pure, unforgiving ice. You raised your own landlord. This house, the imported marble we are standing on, the crystal chandeliers above our heads, the curated art collection in the foyer. Every single brick of this estate was bought with my stolen trust money. Patricia's mouth opened and closed silently, her face flushing a dangerous mottled crimson. The relatives around the table gasped in unison. Aunt Martha actually gripped her chest, her eyes darting between Patricia's horrified face and the undeniable legal document resting on the table. The reality of my words stripped Patricia of her most prized possession, her deeply ingrained social superiority. She was not a wealthy matriarch. She was a squatter living on stolen funds. Brittany, entirely incapable of accepting a reality where she was not the center of the universe, slammed her hands flat on the table. Her pristine facade shattered, tears ruining her immaculate makeup as she glared at me with absolute venom. "Shut up!" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking with desperate entitlement. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me. Dad is a brilliant investor. You are just a bitter, lonely corporate drone trying to ruin my life because you have nothing of your own." I turned my gaze to my sister, feeling a profound wave of pity mixed with an unshakable, ruthless resolve. I had spent my entire life feeling inferior to her, wondering why I was never enough. Now, looking at her frantic, tear-stained face, I saw exactly what she was. Your cars, your luxurious European vacations, your entire designer life. I listed, evenly locking eyes with her. Funded by a 7-year-old stolen inheritance. You are not a success story, Brittany. You are a highly subsidized parasite. You have never achieved a single thing on your own merit. You survived entirely on the interest generated by my name. You were given the world and it was purchased with my blood. I did not expect them to simply surrender to my words. They had spent decades building an alternate reality, and they needed visual, irrefutable annihilation. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out my smartphone. With a single decisive tap on the screen, I synced my device to the massive 80-inch smart television mounted above the fireplace in the adjoining living room, perfectly visible from the dining table. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, bright glow over the dimly lit room. I had instructed Elise to prepare a specific visual presentation of our forensic accounting audit. The television displayed a split-screen projection that left absolutely zero room for interpretation or denial. On the left side of the screen were the official court-verified withdrawal records from my grandmother's trust fund. On the right side were the exact matching deposits flowing directly into Richard's private shell corporations. But the final nail in the coffin was the center overlay. It was a high-resolution scan of a dark green handwritten ledger, Brittany's personal unredacted financial logs. "I want all of you to look at the screen," I commanded, projecting my voice so every single relative could hear the undeniable truth. "This is not a family dispute. This is a meticulously documented 27-year financial crime." The television slowly scrolled through the records. It showed the exact date Richard withdrew $80,000 from my trust, perfectly corresponding to the exact purchase date of Brittany's first luxury SUV. It showed the systematic quarterly transfers of $25,000, explicitly labeled as educational funding, that went straight to paying for Brittany's children's private schooling. It displayed the fraudulent tax returns where Richard extorted rent from me for a downtown condominium I already legally owned. Every stolen cent was documented, cross-referenced, and laid bare for the entire extended family to see. The relatives stared at the glowing screen in horrified absolute silence. They were watching the systematic dismantling of a man they had admired, feared, and respected for decades. The entire foundation of the Vance family was built on the systematic financial abuse of an orphaned child. Richard finally snapped. The sheer weight of the exposure broke his silence, and the broken patriarch suddenly slammed his fist onto the table. The impact shattered a crystal wine glass, sending a spray of dark red burgundy bleeding into the pristine white tablecloth like a fresh wound. "I earned every single cent," Richard roared, his face contorted in a desperate, ugly, terrifying rage. The mask was completely gone. "I took you in. I managed that money. I protected it from taxes. I am absolutely entitled to compensation for raising a deeply troubled, ungrateful child. You would have squandered it all. I built this family. I gave you the privilege of carrying my name." I did not flinch. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out two thick, legally bound manila folders. I placed them on the mahogany surface and pushed them hard. They glided smoothly down the length of the long table, coming to a dead stop directly in front of his ruined dinner plate. "That is a federal fraud lawsuit," I explained, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "And right beneath it is a formal eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate my property. Furthermore, the FBI has already been notified of the wire fraud. Their Financial Crimes Division froze your accounts at 4:15 this afternoon. You are entirely destitute, Richard." The entire room seemed to stop breathing. The absolute finality of the federal government being involved paralyzed the remaining family members. There was no talking their way out of a federal indictment. Brittany hyperventilating and completely unspooling as the reality of her impending poverty crashed down on her, spun around to face her husband. Jamal had been standing near the back of the room near the archway, completely silent throughout the entire brutal confrontation. It was Jamal who had found that green ledger. It was Jamal who had handed me the final piece of the puzzle. "Jamal, do something!" Brittany screamed, rushing over and clutching frantically at his jacket sleeve. "Call your lawyers. Defend me. Tell them she's crazy. This is our money. Defend your family." Jamal looked down at his wife. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Richard, the man who had spent a decade treating him like a subordinate. He remembered every single racial microaggression Richard had ever made at these very dinner parties. He remembered Richard calling him a charity case who needed the Vance family money to properly provide for Brittany. He remembered the sickening, soul-crushing realization that his own pride as a father and a husband had been bought and paid for with funds stolen from Claire. Richard had played the benevolent white savior while secretly running a criminal enterprise to fund it. Jamal gently but firmly pulled his arm away from Brittany's desperate grasp. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He simply looked at the woman he had married and realized he did not know her at all. She had kept that ledger. She had known. Jamal slowly reached down to his left hand. With steady, deliberate movements, he pulled his gold wedding band off his finger. He walked over to the edge of the dining table and placed the ring down on the polished wood. The soft, metallic clink echoed loudly in the stunned, breathless room. He turned away from Brittany, ignoring her horrified gasp, and walked the length of the room. He did not stop until he was standing firmly right beside me and Uncle David physically and symbolically crossing the battle line. "I don't defend thieves," Jamal stated quietly, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute closure. The heavy silence in the dining room was finally broken by Brittany's piercing, hysterical scream. She lunged forward, her hands grasping wildly at empty air as Jamal turned his back on her. He did not hesitate. He did not look over his shoulder. He walked steadily past the frozen, terrified faces of the extended family and followed me out the grand mahogany doors. Uncle David flanked my right side, his heavy work boots thudding against the marble floors, leaving behind the shattered remains of Richard's empire. We walked out into the crisp evening air, leaving the front door wide open behind us. The frantic, echoing sounds of Patricia weeping and Richard shouting furiously at his own relatives spilled out into the driveway. I did not look back. I stepped into my waiting town car, Jamal and David getting into their respective vehicles, completely severing our ties to the Vance family estate. The trap had been sprung. Now the guillotine was going to drop. The next morning broke with the cold, clinical precision of a military operation. At exactly 8 o'clock, the federal authorities executed the seizure warrants. Richard was sitting in his private corner office at the downtown investment firm he falsely claimed to own. He was frantically barking orders at his wealth managers, desperately trying to wire the remaining liquid assets from his shell corporations into an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He thought he had a 24-hour window to hide the cash before the federal bureaucracy caught up with him. He was completely wrong. When his chief financial officer hit the transfer authorization key, the banking terminal flashed a hard, glowing red error message. Access denied. Richard shoved the man aside and frantically typed his own overriding executive credentials into the system. Access denied. Account frozen pending federal investigation. At that exact moment, 2 black sports utility vehicles pulled up to the front doors of his corporate building. 4 agents wearing dark windbreakers walked straight past the protesting security guards and entered the elevators. Richard's entire financial reality evaporated in a matter of seconds. Every single checking account, every high-yield savings portfolio, every line of corporate credit tied to the Vance name was instantly and completely locked down. He could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone fund a legal defense. Across the city, entirely unaware of the federal raid currently dismantling her father's office, Brittany was attempting to soothe her mounting anxiety the only way she knew how: retail therapy. She walked into an exclusive appointment-only designer boutique in the luxury shopping district. Her eyes were hidden behind oversized dark sunglasses to mask the swelling from her crying fit the night before. She gathered armfuls of silk blouses, a cashmere winter coat, and 3 different leather handbags, dumping the massive pile onto the glass display counter. The total rang up to just over $14,000. Brittany did not even blink. She reached into her designer purse and handed the impeccably dressed sales associate her premium platinum credit card. The card was directly linked to the stolen trust fund yields. The associate swiped the card through the terminal. It beeped aggressively. "I am so sorry, madam," the associate said, maintaining a polite retail smile. "It seems the card was declined. Would you like me to try it again?" Brittany scoffed, snatching the card back and wiping it on her coat. "Your machine is broken. Just run it manually. My father owns half the real estate on this block." The associate typed the numbers into the keypad. The terminal beeped a second time. The screen flashed a harsh message telling the merchant to confiscate the card. The associate's polite smile faltered her gaze, shifting to the growing line of wealthy patrons forming behind Brittany. "I am afraid it has been completely rejected by the issuer," the associate stated, her voice dropping to a low, embarrassed whisper. "Do you have another form of payment?" Panic flared in Brittany's chest. She pulled out a secondary corporate card, then a personal debit card, throwing them onto the glass counter. "Run those?" she snapped, her voice pitching upward in desperation. "Run all of them!" The associate ran the cards in rapid succession. Declined. 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 The women standing in line behind Brittany began to whisper, their eyes darting over her frantic, unspooling behavior. The absolute humiliation of the moment mirrored the exact public shame my mother and sister had subjected me to for decades. Brittany grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed Richard's private line. It went straight to a disconnected, automated tone. She dialed Patricia. Patricia answered on the first ring, her voice a shrill, hyperventilating mess. "We are locked out!" Patricia sobbed into the receiver, the sound of tearing paper echoing in the background. "The bank will not let us log in. The gate guards at the country club just turned my car around. Claire took everything. We have nothing left, Brittany." Brittany dropped her phone. It clattered loudly against the glass display case. She stared at the pile of expensive clothing. She could no longer afford the horrific reality of her new impoverished existence crashing down on her. Meanwhile, inside the sleek glass walls of Elise's downtown law firm, the legal trap was being permanently sealed. Elise sat at her desk, methodically filing the master lawsuit with the state and federal courts. She drafted the injunctions with surgical precision, ensuring that every single asset Richard and Patricia claimed to own was locked in aggressive, suffocating litigation. The sprawling estate, the luxury vehicles, the vacation properties in Europe, the fake logistics holding companies. Elise bound them all in a web of legal red tape so thick they would need a machete to cut through a fraction of it. The Vance family was not just broke. They were legally paralyzed. 3 days later, the sheer desperation of their reality finally broke Patricia's pride. I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a quarterly shipping manifest when my private secretary buzzed the intercom. Her voice was unusually tense. "Miss Vance, your mother is in the ground floor lobby. The security team is asking for instructions. She is refusing to leave the premises, and she is causing a significant disruption." "Send her up," I commanded, not taking my eyes off the spreadsheet on my monitor. "Have 2 guards escort her directly to my office." 5 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my office swung open. Patricia walked in, and I barely recognized the woman standing in front of me. The immaculate, intimidating matriarch of the Vance family was completely gone. Her designer clothes looked slept in. Her hair, usually sprayed into a perfect, unmoving helmet, hung limply around her face. She wore absolutely no makeup, exposing the deep, tired lines around her eyes and the pale, sickly pallor of a woman who had not slept in 72 hours. She collapsed into the leather guest chair opposite my desk, burying her face in her hands. She began to weep. It was not the fake, manipulative crying she used to garner sympathy at dinner parties. These were real, agonizing, terrified tears. "Claire, please," Patricia begged, her voice breaking into a pathetic, ragged whine. "You have to stop this. You have to call your lawyers off." The bank foreclosed on the cars this morning. The country club publicly revoked our membership. Richard is sitting in the living room, staring at a wall. We cannot even buy groceries. You have proven your point. You won. Now please give us our accounts back. We are blood. I slowly set my pen down on the desk. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like a defective burden. I looked at the woman who had allowed my father to forge medical documents claiming I was mentally insane just so she could buy more expensive jewelry. I leaned forward, folding my hands neatly over the polished wood of my desk. My expression remained absolutely void of sympathy. "We are not blood, Patricia. We are simply a financial transaction that has finally reached its conclusion," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the large office. "For 27 years, you did not treat me like a daughter. You treated me like an automated bank account. You extracted my wealth to build a fake kingdom, and you locked me out in the cold." Patricia reached across the desk, trying to grasp my hand. I pulled my arm back, refusing the contact. "I am your mother," she wailed, the tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "You cannot leave us on the street. We will have nothing. We do not know how to survive like this." "You will survive exactly the way you forced me to survive," I replied, standing up from my executive chair and smoothing the front of my blazer. "You will work. You will struggle. You will realize that the world does not owe you a single favor. The federal asset freeze is permanent. The lawsuit is moving forward. You treated me like a bank account, Patricia. Now you can deal with my collections department." I turned my back on her, walking toward the large bay windows overlooking the city. "Escort her out." I ordered the 2 security guards standing by the door. "If she returns to this building, have her arrested for trespassing." Patricia screamed my name, a haunting, desperate sound, as the guards firmly grabbed her arms and pulled her out of the office. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, cutting off her cries entirely. I stood by the window, watching the traffic flow through the busy streets below, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. By the end of the week, Richard was formally indicted by the federal prosecutor's office. The charges included felony wire fraud, grand theft, embezzlement, and forging legal medical documents. Because all of his assets were frozen, he was assigned a tremendously overworked public defender who immediately advised him to accept a plea deal. Richard refused, his arrogance blinding him to his reality, guaranteeing a lengthy, grueling, and highly publicized trial that would inevitably end in a federal prison sentence. Brittany's punishment came from a different, equally terrifying government entity. Elise forwarded the unredacted green ledger directly to the Internal Revenue Service. Because Brittany had been living off the embezzled funds and declaring them as untaxed familial gifts, the IRS slammed her with a catastrophic audit. They assessed massive tax evasion penalties, seizing her remaining personal bank accounts and placing liens on any future income she might ever generate. She was buried under a mountain of federal debt she possessed absolutely no skills to pay off. But the final, most devastating blow to Brittany's perfect life came from Jamal. He did not hesitate. The morning after the dinner, Jamal filed for emergency full custody of their children. He cited Brittany's active involvement in criminal fraud, her impending federal tax evasion charges, and her complete financial ruin as grounds for immediate removal. I instructed Elise to provide Jamal with the full backing of my legal team, ensuring he had the most aggressive family law attorneys in the state operating on his behalf. Brittany, entirely bankrupt and legally cornered, could not even afford to fight him. The judge granted Jamal full permanent custody within a matter of days. He packed up his children, left the keys to the foreclosed house on the kitchen counter, and moved back to his home state, completely erasing Brittany from his future. The fake empire had crumbled into dust. The thieves had been stripped of their stolen gold, their status, and their families. I sat at the head of my own boardroom table, looking at the soaring profit margins of my logistics company, knowing I had built it all with my own hands. I had paid my debts. The ledger was clean. Exactly 30 days later, the heavy wrought iron gates of the Vance estate locked shut for the very last time under the false authority of my abusers. The morning air was crisp and unforgiving, providing perfect clarity for the spectacle unfolding in the sprawling circular driveway. I sat in the back of my town car, parked just beyond the property line, watching the final dominoes fall with absolute clinical detachment. Federal marshals stood by the massive front doors holding clipboards and observing the chaotic, disorganized exit of Patricia and Richard. They had been given 4 weeks to secure alternate housing, but their profound arrogance had convinced them that some last-minute legal miracle would save them. No miracle arrived. Only the stark, brutal reality of a court-ordered eviction. A discount moving truck sat idling on the gravel, a jarring contrast to the imported luxury vehicles that used to line the driveway. Those vehicles had all been repossessed weeks ago. Patricia was frantically hauling taped cardboard boxes out of the grand foyer, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the pavement. She kept looking over her shoulder at the neighboring estates, terrified that the other wealthy socialites were watching her humiliation through their bay windows. They were. The whispering network of the country club elite had completely ostracized her, ensuring she was a social pariah long before she was officially homeless. Richard moved like a hollowed-out ghost. The looming threat of his federal wire fraud trial had stripped away every ounce of his manufactured bravado. He carried a single plastic bin of cheap clothing, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed permanently on the dirt. He did not look at the house. He did not look at Patricia. He was a man entirely broken by his own greed, stepping into a future defined exclusively by public defenders and impending prison sentences. Elise, my lead attorney, stood near the front steps, holding a thick leather portfolio. Once the discount moving truck was loaded and the marshals confirmed the premises were entirely vacated, Elise stepped forward. She did not offer a handshake or a polite goodbye. She simply watched Patricia and Richard pull away in a battered rental sedan, their stolen empire shrinking in the rearview mirror. Elise walked down the driveway and slid into the back seat of my car, handing me a heavy stack of notarized documents. "The property is officially vacated," Elise stated, her voice carrying the sharp, satisfying tone of total victory. "The deed has been legally transferred back to your private holding company. You have absolute sovereign ownership of the estate, Claire. You can move in immediately." I looked down at the documents bearing my name and then looked up at the towering stone columns of the mansion. The house represented 27 years of psychological warfare, financial exploitation, and suffocating control. It was a monument to my stolen childhood, and I had absolutely zero intention of spending another second inside its walls. "I am not moving in," I replied, sliding the deed back across the leather seat. "Sell it." Elise raised an eyebrow, pulling out her tablet. "We can list it on the luxury market by this afternoon. It will fetch a premium price given the acreage and the architectural history. Do not list it on the residential market." I instructed, my gaze fixed on the imposing structure. "Sell it directly to a commercial developer. Find the most aggressive corporate real estate firm in the city and hand them the keys. Tell them, I do not care what they build on this land, as long as they bring in a fleet of bulldozers and tear that house down to its very foundation. I want the estate completely erased from the map." Elise smiled, a sharp, understanding expression crossing her features. "Consider it leveled," she said, tapping a rapid series of commands into her device. "And the proceeds from the commercial land sale. Every single cent goes into a newly established philanthropic trust," I stated, leaning back against the headrest. "I want the foundation structured immediately. The sole purpose of the fund will be providing aggressive legal representation and forensic accounting services to young adults and youths who are trapped in financially abusive family dynamics." I looked at the empty driveway, imagining the thousands of young women who were currently sitting exactly where I had been isolated, manipulated, and told they were worthless by the very people draining their accounts. My parents used this stolen money to build a prison. I continued, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I am going to use the rubble of that prison to hand a sledgehammer to anyone else fighting to break out of theirs. They wanted a family legacy. This will be the Vance legacy. Complete financial liberation for their victims." The sale moved with unprecedented speed. Within 10 days, a massive commercial development group purchased the entire 3-acre lot, paying entirely in cash. The day the heavy construction equipment rolled through the iron gates to tear down the stone columns, I was already 3,000 miles away, standing on the opposite edge of the country. The salt air of the Pacific Ocean whipped gently across my face, carrying the clean, sharp scent of open water. I stood on the expansive wrap-around balcony of my newly purchased home. It was a stunning architectural masterpiece of glass and light, perched high on a coastal cliff in Southern California. There were no heavy mahogany doors. There were no dark, suffocating hallways or antique crystal chandeliers. The walls were entirely transparent, letting the endless blue horizon flood every single room with natural sunlight. I had bought the property outright using funds I had generated entirely through my own logistics firm. There was not a single shadow of my grandmother's trust money tied to the mortgage. It was clean, it was mine, and it was utterly silent. The silence was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of the dining room where my family had plotted my ruin. It was the rich, vibrant silence of absolute autonomy. I did not have to brace myself for Patricia's passive-aggressive insults. I did not have to endure Richard's suffocating lectures on loyalty while he actively drained my bank accounts. I did not have to look at Brittany and wonder why my existence was considered a burden while her parasitic lifestyle was celebrated as a triumph. They were gone, completely legally and geographically eradicated from my reality. I walked into the massive open-concept kitchen and picked up a bottle of crisp, chilled white wine from the Marble Island. I poured a glass, listening to the satisfying rhythmic crashing of the waves hitting the rocks far below. I walked slowly back out onto the balcony, leaning against the sleek glass railing to watch the late afternoon sun begin its slow descent toward the water. The sky was turning a brilliant shade of burning gold and deep violet. A sharp, buzzing vibration broke the tranquility. I glanced down at the glass patio table. My smartphone was dancing across the smooth surface, the screen illuminating brightly against the fading daylight. I picked up the device and stared at the caller identification. Restricted number. My thumb hovered over the screen. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. Richard's federal wire fraud trial was scheduled to begin the following Monday. He was likely sitting in a stark concrete holding cell or huddled in a cheap motel room with a prepaid burner phone desperately trying to reach me. He was calling to beg. He was calling to manipulate. He was calling to deploy the final desperate weapon of a dying narcissist, pleading for me to remember that we were family and demanding that I drop the charges to save him from a decade behind bars. He was expecting me to answer. He was expecting the trained, compliant daughter he had meticulously engineered over 27 years to finally crack under the weight of his manufactured sorrow. I did not swipe the green button. I did not decline the call. I simply let it ring, watching the restricted numbers flash across the screen. True power is not forcing your abusers to listen to you scream. True power is recognizing that their voices no longer hold any currency in your universe. I set my wine glass down on the table. With calm, steady fingers, I pulled the protective case off the back of the smartphone. I reached up and unclasped the sharp backing of my diamond earring. Using the thin metal post, I pressed firmly into the tiny pinhole on the side of the device. The small tray popped out with a soft, satisfying click. I pulled the tray free and tipped the plastic SIM card into the palm of my hand. The phone immediately lost its cellular signal, the screen going completely dark, cutting off the incoming call instantly and permanently. I walked over to the edge of the balcony and held my hand out over the small, stainless steel trash receptacle tucked neatly beside the patio doors. I opened my fingers and let the tiny plastic chip drop. It hit the bottom of the empty metal bin with a quiet, final sound. I walked back to the glass railing and picked up my wine. I took a slow, deep sip, savoring the sharp, clean taste of the vintage as the burning golden sun finally dipped below the ocean horizon. I breathed in the cool evening air, feeling my lungs expand without restriction, without fear, and without the suffocating weight of the Vance family name. I was finally absolutely free,